thumb. 1910. The city frozen in time. What if an entire town didn't slowly die, but simply stopped in 1910? Garnet City was alive, working, breathing like any other frontier town. And then, without warning, time froze. Imagine waking up to the sound of boots on wooden sidewalks, the creak of doors opening, the smell of coal smoke drifting from chimneys. Garnet City was not a myth or a failed dream. It was real, mapped, populated, taxed, and economically active. Families lived here, children grew up here, businesses depended on its existence. And yet, something happened that year that would sever its connection with the future. The official records tell us almost nothing about a single catastrophic event. No Great Fire listed, no epidemic officially declared, no massacre documented, and that silence is exactly where the unease begins. Because when historians later walked through Garnet City, they didn't find the slow decay typical of abandoned places. They found interruption, homes still held furniture in place. Personal belongings were left behind as if people expected to return. Streets showed no signs of long-term neglect at the moment of abandonment. It was as if daily life had been cut mid, a town frozen not by ice, but by circumstance. To understand why 1910 matters, we need to understand what Garnet City represented before that year. It wasn't a remote outpost barely surviving. It was a functioning settlement tied to regional trade routes, sustained by labor, and anchored by the belief that the future would look much like the present. There was no warning sign written into the town's growth, no clear signal that this place was about to vanish. And yet, after 1910, Garnet City effectively disappears from active records, mentions fade, census data becomes fragmented, correspondence stops. It's as if the town slipped into a blind spot of history, existing physically but no longer participating in time. This is what makes Garnet City different from typical ghost towns. Many towns decline gradually when resources dry up or industries collapse. You can trace that arc through falling population numbers, shuttered businesses, and decades of slow erosion. Garnet City doesn't follow that pattern. Its disappearance feels abrupt, unnatural, almost surgical. Even more disturbing are the inconsistencies. Some documents suggest people left voluntarily, yet provide no reason why entire households would abandon possessions essential for survival. Others imply economic hardship, but economic hardship rarely causes synchronized silence. People leave notes, they sell assets, they move gradually. Garnet City shows none of that. Local oral history adds another layer of tension. Decades later, nearby communities spoke of Garnet City as if it were a place best not discussed, not cursed exactly, just closed. A location associated with something unresolved. People avoided it, not because it was dangerous, but because it felt wrong. Like walking into a moment that doesn't belong to you. The year 1910 sits at the center of all these contradictions. Before it, Garnet City exists clearly. After it, the town becomes a question mark. No single document explains why. No unified narrative survives. And that gap creates space for speculation, fear, and theories that refuse to stay buried. Was there an unseen disaster that never made headlines? A slow-building threat that reached a breaking point? Or a decision made collectively under pressure, one that residents believed was temporary, only to become permanent? What we do know is this: whatever happened did not announce itself with drama. There was no final stand, no explosion that echoed through history. Instead, Garnet City slipped out of the timeline quietly, leaving behind structures, objects, and unanswered questions that still resist clean explanations. And the most unsettling thought of all is this: if Garnet City could vanish without a clear cause, without a documented ending, how many other places might have done the same? Their stories erased not by destruction, but by silence. Because once a town stops being remembered, it doesn't just disappear from maps. It disappears from accountability, and that is where the real mystery begins. If this story already feels unsettling, take a moment to really sit with what you've just heard. A town doesn't simply vanish from history without leaving behind uncomfortable questions. And understanding those questions is the only way we get closer to the truth. If Garnet City's silence made you uneasy, let that reaction mean something. Leave a comment sharing what you think could have forced an entire town to walk away in 1910. Was it fear, desperation, or something never officially recorded. Your perspective adds another layer to this investigation. And if stories like this matter to you, make sure you support this kind of deep research. Click like so more people can discover these forgotten places, and check if you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Before it became a mystery, Garnet City was ordinary in the most important way. It was alive. Not a rumor, not a legend, not a failed experiment, but a functioning town stitched into the rhythm of the early 20th century. People didn't pass through Garnet City by accident. They arrived with purpose, stayed with intention, and built lives that assumed continuity. Its origins followed a familiar pattern for frontier. Settlements of the era, opportunity came first. Work followed, then families. Garnet City grew around labor, supply routes, and the promise that effort here would be rewarded with stability. Businesses opened because customers existed. Homes were built because people expected to remain. Schools, storage buildings, and communal spaces didn't appear overnight or by chance. They appeared because Garnet City made sense at the time. This is what makes its disappearance so difficult to reconcile. Towns that fail usually leave a paper trail of decline. Falling trade numbers, bank closures, outmigration visible in census data. Garnet City does not cooperate with that logic. Instead, it seems to step sideways out of history. Maps printed before 1910 show Garnet City clearly labeled, connected by routes that mattered. After that year, newer maps quietly omitted, no annotation explaining why, no footnote marking relocation or destruction, just absence, as if cartographers collectively decided the town no longer deserved ink. Even more unsettling is how quickly official references dry up. Business registrations stop. Mail routes shift without explanation. Legal documents referencing Garnet City as a place of residence suddenly become rare, then non. This isn't how administrative systems usually behave. Bureaucracy is stubborn. It resists erasure, and yet here, erasure seems almost cooperative. Photographic evidence deepens the unease. Images taken before the disappearance show a town that was neither crumbling nor desperate. Buildings appear maintained. Streets look used, not abandoned. There is no visual hint of impending collapse. No visible panic. No boarded windows or mass departures captured in frames. The town looks paused. What's more, Garnet City wasn't isolated from the world. It wasn't a forgotten dot at the end of nowhere. Supplies moved in and out. People traveled between Garnet City and nearby settlements. News flowed in. Letters flowed out, and then, abruptly, the flow stopped. Historians searching for a clean explanation often reach for familiar causes. Economic failure, resource depletion, natural disaster. But Garnet City resists these categories. If the economy had failed, we would see desperation. If resources had run out, there would be evidence of gradual abandonment. If disaster had struck, there would be reports, survivors, or reconstruction efforts. None of those align with what remains. Instead, what emerges is a pattern of synchronized withdrawal, as if many people reached the same conclusion at roughly the same time, not over decades, but within a narrow window. That alone raises troubling questions. Collective decisions of that scale usually require a shared trigger, a threat, a revelation, or a realization that staying carried more risk than leaving. Yet, if such a trigger existed, it left almost no trace in official memory. Which brings us to an uncomfortable possibility. Garnet City may have disappeared not because something dramatic happened, but because something quietly unbearable did. There are towns that die loudly, leaving scars on the landscape. Garnet City seems to have died softly, slipping away before history could react. That softness is deceptive. It invites dismissal. It encourages the assumption that nothing important happened. But silence, when widespread and coordinated, can be louder than catastrophe. And this raises a deeper question. If Garnet City could vanish from maps, records, and public awareness without a formal ending, how fragile is historical memory really? How many other places might have existed fully, functioned normally, and then slipped out of time because no one fought to keep their story alive? Before we move deeper into theories and speculation, it's essential to confront this reality. Garnet City was real, connected, and functioning. His disappearance was not inevitable, and it was not clearly recorded, that gap is not an accident. It is the foundation of the mystery. At this point, take a moment and think about this. If an entire town you lived in suddenly stopped appearing on maps, what would have had to happen for you to leave without explanation? If you have a theory forming already, leave a comment with the word erased and tell me what you think pushed Garnet City out of history. What makes Garnet City truly disturbing is not just that it vanished, but that it seems to have vanished mid-motion. Somewhere between routine and abandonment, there was a narrow window of time when everything still functioned, and then didn't. The final hours before the silence are where the mystery tightens. There are no surviving eyewitness accounts that describe a dramatic last day. No journal entry that says, "Tomorrow we leave." No letter warning relatives to stay away. Instead, historians and researchers have been forced to reconstruct those final hours indirectly through what was left behind, and just as importantly, what was not. Inside several homes, everyday objects remained exactly where they would be during normal life. Cooking utensils were found stored neatly, not packed. Clothing hung in wardrobes, seasonally appropriate, not bundled for travel. Beds where magic tables were cleared. These details matter because they contradict the idea of a planned, permanent departure. When people know they are leaving for good, they take a They prepari. Garnet City shows almost no signs of that mindset. Even more unsettling are the communal spaces. The general store, according to later inspections, still contained inventory that would have been valuable elsewhere. Tools, supplies, items that could have been sold or traded were simply left behind. In frontier towns, material goods were survival. Abandoning them suggests urgency, confusion, or a belief that the absence would be temporary. One of the most puzzling details comes from the layout of the streets themselves. There is no evidence of mass movement in a single direction. No heavily worn exit path, no concentration of abandoned wagons or equipment at the edge of town. Whatever happened, it did not unfold as a chaotic escape. It feels more like a controlled withdrawal, or an interruption before any withdrawal could be completed. This raises a critical question. Did the people of Garnet City intend to return? Some clues suggest they did. Doors were closed, not barricaded. Windows were intact. Important documents, records, and personal items that would normally be secured before a final departure remained exposed. That behavior aligns more with evacuation than abandonment. A decision made under pressure, possibly with the belief that the danger would pass. But evacuation from what? There is no documented fire, no flood scars, no signs of structural damage from an earthquake. The building stood, and many still stand, structurally sound. Nature did not wipe Garnet City away. If the threat was environmental, it left no physical signature. That leaves human causes, illness, violence, or fear of something unseen. Yet here again, records fall silent. No hospital logs from nearby towns note an influx of patients. No burial records spike. No law enforcement reports describe violence spilling outward. The absence of aftermath is as strange as the disappearance itself. Another possibility is that the town did not empty all at once. Perhaps people left in waves over a short period, each departure triggering another, until the town crossed a point of no return. But even this theory struggles against the evidence. A staggered exit would still produce signs of decline. Closed businesses. Gradual neglect. Garnet City skips that phase entirely. It's also worth considering the psychological dimension. Towns are social organisms. When fear takes hold collectively, logic can collapse quickly. Rumors spread faster than facts. A single unexplained event can cascade into panic if people feel they are being kept in the dark, and in isolated communities, trust is fragile when answers don't come. Imagine hearing that something happened to someone down the road, but no one explains what. Then another person leaves unexpectedly. Then another. Actually, saw me point staying feels more dangerous than leaving, even if you don't fully understand why. Fear does not need clarity to spread. It only needs uncertainty. The final hours of Garnet City likely unfolded in this space between knowledge and rumor. A period where nothing obvious was happening, but everything felt wrong. Where people acted on instinct rather than information. Where decisions were made quickly, quietly, and without coordination beyond shared unease. And once enough people left, The town crossed an invisible threshold. Services stopped, communication lines broke. Garnet City ceased to function not because it was destroyed, but because it lost the critical mass required to exist. What's haunting is that this kind of collapse leaves almost no trace, no explosion, no ruins, just empty structures holding the shape of lives that moved on or vanished. As you think about this phase, ask yourself, how many people would have to leave your town before you decided to follow? Even without knowing the reason? Walking through what remains of Garnet City feels less like exploring ruins and more like stepping into an interrupted moment. This is where the mystery deepens, because the physical evidence does not match what history tells us. It usually happens when towns fail. Garnet City does not look abandoned in the way abandonment normally looks. It looks paused. Homes stand with walls upright and roofs intact. Doors were closed, not torn from hinges. Windows were not smashed by desperation or weathered by decades of neglect at the moment people left. Inside, rooms appear organized, almost respectful of routine. Furniture was not overturned. Drawers were not emptied in haste. Nothing suggests chaos. And that calmness is unsettling. In several buildings, items remained positioned as if their owners expected to return. Chairs pulled slightly away from tables, tools stored rather than carried off. In Somi Plus's objects essential for survival in frontier conditions were simply left behind. This is not how people behave when they know they are leaving forever. It is how people behave when they believe the situation is temporary. The streets tell the same story. There is no visible damage consistent with violence or environmental destruction, new burn marks. No collapsed structures, no debris fields that would suggest a storm, fire, or explosion. The ground itself offers few clues. No deep ruts from overloaded wagons fleeing town. No bottlenecks where everyone tried to leave at once. The absence of movement marks implies that whatever happened did not involve a frantic escape. This raises a disturbing possibility. The departure may not have been driven by panic, but by instruction. A warning, a directive that did not require speed, but compliance. Something that convinced people to leave calmly, quickly, and with the expectation that they could return once the threat passed. Another detail complicates the picture even further. There is little evidence of looting. In abandoned towns, especially those left suddenly, valuables tend to disappear quickly, taken either by those leaving or by outsiders who arrive soon after. Garnet City does not show strong signs of this. That suggests the town became inaccessible, avoided, or deliberately left alone shortly after it emptied. Why would that happen? Nearby settlements reportedly treated Garnet City as off limits in the years that followed, not officially quarantined, not guarded, but quietly excluded. People did not move into the empty buildings. Businesses did not relocate there. Travelers avoided it. This kind of social avoidance rarely happens without a shared understanding that something is wrong. The layout of Garnet City reinforces this sense of intentional stillness. Public spaces remain recognizable. Paths between buildings remain clear. There is no evidence that the town struggled in its final days to function. It did not shrink inward. It did not cannibalize itself. It simply stopped being used. This is where many explanations fail. Economic collapse does not freeze a town in place. It erodes it. People sell what they can. Buildings are repurposed. Materials are salvaged. Garnet City skipped all of that. Decline never got the chance to leave its fingerprints. Environmental disaster is equally unconvincing. Floods leave what? Fires leave ash. Landslides leave scars. None of those signatures dominate Garnet City. The structures are not survivors of catastrophe. They are witnesses to absence. That leaves us with something more uncomfortable. A decision made under incomplete information. A belief that staying was unsafe, but leaving was survivable. And perhaps most importantly, a belief that explaining the reason was either impossible or dangerous. Silence can be protective. Sometimes people stop talking, not because they don't know what happened, but because they do. And whatever knowledge they hold feels too unstable, too frightening, or too uncertain to share. As years passed, The intact homes and empty streets became part of Garnet City's reputation. Visitors described an unnatural, quiet, not the quiet of decay, but the quiet of something held in suspension, like a place waiting for permission to continue existing. And that leads to a chilling question. If Garnet City was left with the expectation of return, what prevented that return from ever happening? What condition never resolved? What threat never lifted? Because towns that expect to be abandoned prepare for it. Garnet City did not. It prepared to wait. Take a moment to think about this. If you were told to leave your home calmly, without packing everything, believing you would come back soon, what would have convinced you to obey? What turns Garnet City from an abandoned town into a true historical anomaly is not the empty buildings, but the people who should have reappeared somewhere else and didn't. Towns vanish all the time. People rarely do. And yet, when researchers began tracing former residents of Garnet City after 1910, they encountered an unsettling pattern of absence. Names appear in records before that year with consistency. Census entries, property mentions, employment notes, church lists, families rooted enough to own land, raise children, and invest their labor locally. Then, abruptly, many of those names stop appearing anywhere nearby. Not in neighboring towns, not in regional registries, not even in migration records where you would expect displaced populations to surface. This is not about one or two individuals. It is about clusters. Entire households that simply vanish from the paper trail in an era when movement was slower, more deliberate, and often documented. This kind of disappearance is statistically unusual. Even people who left suddenly due to hardship typically resurfaced somewhere else within months or years. Garnet City's missing residents often do not. Some historians argue that records were simply lost. Fires, poor archiving, incomplete documentation. That explanation works occasionally, but it fails at scale. When dozens of unrelated individuals disappear from multiple record systems simultaneously, coincidence becomes less convincing. Even more troubling are partial traces. In a few cases, individuals connected to Garnet City appear briefly elsewhere after 1910, only to vanish again. A name surfaces in a payroll ledger, a marriage license, a shipping manifest, then nothing. As if whatever displacement occurred was not a clean relocation, but a transition into instability. This raises difficult questions. Did people leave together, following the same routes? Did they scatter widely, making them harder to trace? Or did something happen during or shortly after departure that prevented resettlement altogether? Oral histories from surrounding regions deepen the unease. Stories passed down generations speak of former Garnet City residents arriving elsewhere, disoriented, unwilling to talk about where they came from, sometimes staying only briefly before moving on again. These accounts are inconsistent, often vague, but they share one trait: avoidance. A refusal to explain. Avoidance can mean trauma. It can also mean fear of consequences. When people experience something they believe others won't understand, or that could bring harm if repeated, silence becomes a survival strategy. Another overlooked detail is age distribution. The disappearances are not limited to young mobile workers. Families with children, older adults, and long-term residents all seem affected. This undermines theories centered on economic migration. People with deep roots and dependence rarely vanish without a destination. Death records offer little clarity. There is no spike in mortality linked to Garnet City residents elsewhere. No mass graves discovered. No epidemic acknowledged. Whatever happened did not resolve itself through a documented tragedy. Instead, it dissolved people into uncertainty. One explanation some researchers cautiously entertain is forced dispersal, not by violence, but by pressure. Orders that didn't require immediate explanation. Instructions framed as temporary safety measures. If people were told to leave quietly and not return, they might comply, believing resistance was pointless or dangerous. Another possibility is social fracture after departure. Leaving Garnet City may have broken communal bonds so completely that former residents never regrouped. Isolated individuals are easier to lose in history than communities, but even that does not explain the emotional weight attached to the town's name in later decades. Garnet City was not spoken of nostalgically, it was spoken of reluctantly, as if remembering it carried risk. When towns disappear, Their people usually carry the story forward. They tell their children. They explain why they left. Garnet City's story seems to have been deliberately muted, either because no one agreed on what happened, or because the truth was too destabilizing to preserve. And that leads to a chilling thought. Perhaps the greatest loss of Garnet City was not the town itself, but the shared narrative that should have followed its people into the future. To understand why Garnet City collapsed the way it did, you have to stop thinking of it as just a town and start thinking of it as a location. Geography is never neutral. It amplifies stress, limits options, and quietly shapes decisions long before people realize what's happening. On paper, Garnet City was connected. In reality, it was isolated in ways that only become obvious under pressure. Access routes were few, narrow, and vulnerable to seasonal disruption. What looked like manageable distance in good weather became a liability when conditions shifted. Roads that functioned in summer could become impassable for weeks during harsh winters or extended storms. Supply lines that felt reliable suddenly weren't. Climate intensified that fragility. Garnet City existed in an environment where weather could turn from inconvenience to threat with little warning. Long cold seasons, sudden temperature drops, heavy snowfall, and unpredictable storms didn't just affect comfort. They affected food storage, transport, communication, and health. A single bad season could cascade into shortages, illness, and fear. And fear behaves differently in isolated places. In cities, uncertainty spreads, but so do explanations. In remote towns, uncertainty echoes. When rumors circulate without external confirmation, they gain weight. A delayed supply shipment isn't just late. It becomes a signal. A storm isn't just weather. It becomes a warning. Geography also affects response time. If something went wrong in Garnet City, help would not arrive quickly. Medical emergencies, infrastructure failures, environmental threats, everything took longer. And when people know they're on their own, they make different calculations about risk. This matters because isolation doesn't need a dramatic event to trigger collapse. It only needs a convergence of stressors, a harsh season, reduced access, unclear information, and a sense that waiting things out might be more dangerous than leaving. There's another overlooked factor: psychological geography. Garnet City wasn't just physically remote. It was mentally distant from centers of authority. If residents believed that warnings or instructions came from unreliable sources, or that official help would be delayed or denied, they might have acted preemptively. Imagine hearing that conditions ahead will worsen, but no one can tell you how bad or for how long. Imagine knowing that if you stay and you're wrong, you might not get a second chance. Geography turns those unknowns into pressure. Historical weather data from the broader region shows periods of abnormal severity. Around the years leading up to 1910, harsh winters, extended cold snaps, disrupted transport. On their own, none of these would erase a town. But layered onto isolation, they could push a community toward a collective decision. Then there's the issue of visibility. Garnet City was out of sight and therefore out of mind. When towns collapse quietly in remote terrain, they don't attract attention. No journalists arrive. No officials rush in. The absence of oversight allows situations to resolve without documentation. Geography doesn't just trap people physically. It traps stories. When a place is hard to reach, its narrative is easy to lose. Some researchers believe Garnet City crossed a critical threshold where isolation magnified every problem at once. Supplies became uncertain, weather increased risk, communication weakened, and the cost of staying began to outweigh the cost of leaving, even without a clear destination. What makes this theory unsettling is that it doesn't require a mystery. No secret event, no hidden force. Just a location that quietly stopped supporting human life under stress. And once a town emptied, geography's finished the job. Distance kept others away. Climate accelerated decay. Silence settled in. But geography alone still doesn't explain the lingering avoidance. Other isolated towns were abandoned and later reclaimed. Garnet City wasn't. Something about this place resisted reintegration, as if the land itself had crossed a line. So the question becomes this: did geography merely contribute to Garnet City's collapse, or did it actively seal its fate? When Garnet City vanished from active use, authorities eventually felt pressure to explain what had happened. Towns disappearing without explanation create discomfort, not just for historians, but for systems that rely on order, documentation, and control. And so, over time, a series of official explanations emerged. None of them ever truly settled the matter. The first explanation leaned heavily on economics. Officials suggested Garnet City declined because it was no longer profitable. Resources dried up. Work disappeared. People moved on. On the surface, this sounds reasonable. It is the most common cause of abandonment in frontier towns, but the evidence doesn't support it. There is no clear record of a sudden economic crash tied specifically to Garnet City. No documented collapse of its primary industries. No trail of unpaid debts or mass foreclosures. Economic decline leaves paperwork. Garnet City leaves gaps. Another explanation pointed to environmental hardship, harsh winters, difficult terrain, unreliable access. These factors were real, but they were not new. Garnet City had survived similar conditions for years. Towns adapt to climate over time. They don't suddenly disappear unless something changes dramatically. And there is no record of a singular environmental event severe enough to justify total withdrawal. A third theory blamed gradual According to this view, people simply left over time until the town became unsustainable. But this explanation directly contradicts the physical evidence. Garnet City does not show the layered decay of slow abandonment. Buildings were not repurposed. Infrastructure was not stripped. The town did not shrink inward. It stopped. Some officials suggested that Garnet City was absorbed into nearby jurisdictions. Its name quietly retired. But this fails to explain why residents vanished from records altogether, or why no replacement settlement absorbed the population visibly. Names don't disappear just because boundaries change. What's striking is not just that these explanations are weak, but that they were accepted without challenge. There was no formal investigation, no public inquiry, no attempt to reconcile conflicting evidence. The explanations functioned more like placeholders than answers. They allowed the topic to be closed without being resolved. This raises a deeper issue. Authorities are often more concerned with maintaining continuity than uncovering uncomfortable truths. When an event resists clean classification, it becomes easier to simplify it than to probe it, especially when probing might reveal failure, negligence, or fear-driven decisions. In Garnet City's case, the lack of scrutiny is telling. It suggests either that the disappearance was considered unimportant at the time, or that asking too many questions risked opening problems no one wanted to deal with. Remote towns, after all, do not command urgency unless they threaten something larger. There is also the possibility that officials genuinely didn't know what happened. If the departure occurred quietly, without violence or disaster, there may have been nothing obvious to investigate, but ignorance does not. Explain why the topic remained dormant for so long, or why later attempts to revisit it were met with indifference. Official explanations tend to leave behind a sense of closure. Garnet City's explanations do the opposite. They feel incomplete, evasive, almost rehearsed. They answer just enough to prevent curiosity from escalating, but not enough to satisfy it. And when official narratives fail to convince, they create space for something else. Doubt, speculation, unofficial stories that fill the silence left behind. That space is where Garnet City truly lives now. Not in records, but in unresolved tension. Ask yourself this. If the explanation were truly simple, why does it still feel wrong more than a century later? When official explanations fail to satisfy, people turn to stories, not because they are irrational, but because stories often preserve what records choose to forget. Around Garnet City, rumors and local legends didn't appear immediately. They accumulated slowly, growing in the spaces where documentation went quiet. In nearby communities, Garnet City was rarely discussed directly. When it was mentioned, it came wrapped in hesitation. People spoke as if naming the place required caution, as though the town itself carried weight beyond its ruins. This wasn't the dramatic language of curses or monsters. It was a tone that suggested something unresolved, something best left alone. One recurring story centers on warnings, not warnings of disaster, but warnings of presence. Locals spoke of a period when people in Garnet City began reporting disturbances that didn't fit any single category. Not crime, not illness, not weather. Just a growing sense that something was wrong. Livestock behaving erratically, unexplained sounds at night, sudden changes in routine that no one could fully explain. These accounts are inconsistent, as rumors often are, but they share a theme of escalation. Small incidents dismissed at first, then repetition, then accumulation, the kind of pattern that doesn't trigger immediate flight, but erodes confidence over time. Another legend speaks of outsiders, not invaders or attackers, but observers, people who passed through without settling, who asked questions that felt intrusive, who left without explanation. In isolated towns, unfamiliar faces stand out, and when those faces appear shortly before disruption, they become anchors for suspicion. There are also stories of messages, notices delivered quietly, instructions that did not come from known authorities. Some accounts claim residents were told to leave temporarily for their own safety. Others suggest warnings of contamination or instability, never explained in detail. The lack of specificity is important. Vague threats are often more powerful than clear ones because they leave the imagination to fill in the worst possibilities. What makes these stories persistent is not their content, but their consistency across generations. Different families, separated by time and distance, repeat variations of the same unease. That does not make the stories true in a literal sense, but it suggests a shared emotional memory. There are also darker versions. Tales of people who tried to return and felt compelled to leave again. Of equipment malfunctioning, of sudden illness or panic with no clear cause. These accounts are often dismissed as folklore, but folklore usually attaches itself to places where something disrupted normal experience. It's worth noting what these stories do not include. There are no heroic rescues, no final confrontations, no clear villains. The absence of narrative resolution mirrors the town's physical stillness. Everything stops short of explanation. Skeptics argued that these rumors emerged long after the fact, shaped by imagination and hindsight, that people needed a reason, any reason, to explain an uncomfortable gap in history. That may be true in part, but even invented stories reveal something real, the need to make sense of silence. When a town disappears without closure, it creates psychological pressure. Humans are pattern seekers. We fill voids because emptiness is intolerable. Garnet City's legends may not tell us exactly what happened, but they tell us how the disappearance was experienced emotionally by those who live nearby. Fear without an object, avoidance without a rule, memory without clarity. And there is one final detail that stands out. Unlike many ghost towns, Garnet City never became a place of romantic fascination in its early years. People didn't move in. They didn't scavenge extensively. They didn't mythologize it immediately. They stayed away. That kind of restraint usually signals respect or fear. So the question becomes, were these stories created to explain Garnet City, or did Garnet City create them by leaving something unfinished in the collective mind? When Garnet City was eventually revisited years after its disappearance, those who entered were not prepared for what they found. Not destruction, not collapse, but preservation in a form that felt deeply unnatural. The town had aged, yes, but not in the way abandoned places usually do. It felt as if time had moved around it, not through it. Early explorers described the experience as disorienting. Buildings stood where maps said they should. Streets aligned perfectly with old layouts, yet the atmosphere felt wrong, as if the town was missing a layer of life that should have lingered there. Was no gradual transition from living space to ruin. Garnet City felt interrupted rather than abandoned. Inside several structures, explorers reported finding objects that had no reason to remain untouched for so long. Paper documents lay where moisture and decay should have destroyed them. Tools rested where rust should have claimed them sooner. Even accounting for dry climate conditions, the level of preservation raised questions. It was as though decay had been delayed, slowed, or uneven. One particularly troubling discovery involved written materials, notes, ledgers, and records that referenced normal daily operations simply stopped mid-entry. Not finished, not concluded, just ended. Pages left blank where future dates should have been. This wasn't a symbolic detail added later. It was physically present in the materials themselves. Personal belongings told a similar story. Items of emotional value were left behind. Things people rarely abandon unless they believe separation, while the brief photographs, keepsakes, family objects, These finds reinforce the idea that Garnet City's residents did not leave with the mindset of finality. Some explorers reported a strange psychological effect while inside the town, a sensation of pressure, discomfort without clear cause, the feeling of being watched, not by anything visible, but by absence itself. These accounts are subjective, of course, but the consistency is worth noting. Multiple visitors described unease strong, enough to shorten their visits. There were also signs of attempts to return, footprints from different decades, temporary camps set up and abandoned quickly, tools brought in and left behind. It appears that people tried to reoccupy or explore Garnet City more than once, but never stayed long. Something pushed them away, even if they couldn't articulate what it was. Importantly, nothing definitive was ever found. No evidence of violence, no toxic residue, no mechanical failure that explained the town's fate. Every investigation ended the same way, with more questions than answers. Garnet City resisted closure. Over time, official interest faded. Exploration became sporadic. The town slipped back into silence, carrying the weight of all those unfinished encounters. What remained was not proof, but tension, a sense that the ruins were holding something just out of reach of explanation. Ruins usually tell stories through decay. Garnet City tells its story through restraint, through what didn't happen, through what stopped rather than what ended. And that leaves one final question before we reach the heart of this mystery. If Garnet City was physically intact, if nothing obvious destroyed it, and if every attempt to reclaim it failed quietly, then what exactly were people responding to? By the time Garnet City faded completely from memory, it had become something more than an abandoned settlement. It had turned into a pattern, not an isolated case, but part of a larger phenomena that history struggles to explain. Towns that don't collapse loudly, don't burn, don't flood, don't get wiped out by a single documented catastrophe, yet still vanish, as if they were never meant to exist beyond a certain point in time. When researchers began comparing Garnet City to other forgotten towns, unsettling similarities emerged. Places scattered across different regions and eras showed the same characteristics: abrupt abandonment, minimal signs of struggle, personal belongings left behind, records that fade instead of ending, communities that dissolve without a final chapter. What connects to these places is not geography, culture, or economy. It's silence, a kind of historical void where explanation should be. Garnet City fits this pattern perfectly. Its disappearance does not align with how systems usually fail. Governments collapse with paperwork, economies collapse with numbers, disasters collapse landscapes. Garnet City collapsed into absence. And the absence is difficult to investigate because it leaves nothing solid to push against. This is why the town continues to unsettle historians. It forces an uncomfortable question. Are there moments when entire communities decide, consciously or not, to step out of the future? Not because they are destroyed, but because continuing becomes impossible under conditions that never make it into official records. Fear does not always announce itself. Sometimes it spreads quietly, shared through looks, pauses, unspoken understanding. Sometimes the most powerful forces are the ones people refuse to name. Garnet City may represent a moment when naming the problem felt more dangerous than leaving it behind. There is also the question of memory. History is not just what happens, but what survives documentation. When towns disappear quietly, they test the limits of historical truth. They reveal how much of the past depends on someone insisting that a story be told. Garnet City had no champion, no advocate, no reason, apparently, to be preserved. And yet here it is, resurfacing more than a century later, precisely because it never resolved. Its power lies in what it refuses to explain. It stands as a reminder that not all losses are dramatic, and not all endings are visible. In many ways, Garnet City is less about what happened in 1910 and more about what didn't happen afterward. No return, no reconstruction, no closure. Just a place that remained frozen while the world moved on around it. That may be the most unsettling truth of all. Not that Garnet City disappeared, but that it was allowed to disappear. Forgotten, unchallenged, and unexamined for decades, its silence became normal. And once silence becomes normal, it spreads. So when we ask what Garnet City symbolizes, the answer may be this. History does not only erase through violence or disaster, sometimes it erases through neglect, fear, and the collective decision not to look too closely. If Garnet City could vanish, what other places might still be missing from our understanding of the past, waiting for someone to notice the gap? Before we close this chapter, think about this question carefully. Do towns disappear because something happens to them, or because no one is willing to carry their story forward? If you stayed with this story until the very end, it means something about Garnet City stayed with you too. Towns don't disappear like this without leaving questions behind, and now, those questions belong to you as well. If this mystery made you think, take a moment to leave a comment and write Frozen in Time. Share your theory about what truly caused Garnet City to vanish in 1910. Was it fear, silence, neglect, or something history chose not to record? Make sure to leave a like if you value deep, carefully researched stories about forgotten places and unresolved mysteries. That simple action helps keep stories like this alive. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe. Now, this channel exists to uncover the dark histories that were never meant to be revisited. The next video is already appearing on your screen, and it explores another place that vanished without explanation. Click it now and continue the journey into the parts of history that refuse to stay buried.